course, no list would be complete. No discussion about the history of horror would be complete without talking about Nosferatu. Now, Nosferatu was an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it is one of the first films where we actually see vampires. So basically, the plot is that a gentleman named Thomas Hutter, or in some films he's actually called Jonathan, the version I watched he was Jonathan, is sent to Transylvania to meet Count Orlok. Now, this adaptation was not actually an official adaptation, so the names have been changed. So instead of it being Count Dracula, he became Count Orlok. Instead of them being vampires, it's called Nosferatu. So there were other differences that had to be made, or that were made, because again, this was not an official adaptation of the book. So Thomas Hutter, or Jonathan Hutter, is sent to Transylvania to meet with Count Orlok. And Count Orlok is interested in purchasing property, potentially across the street from where Mr. Hutter lives. And so he's going to go and meet his new client. And while he's away, he's going to leave his wife, who in some versions is called Ellen, and in other versions is called Mina. The version I watched, it was Mina. And so he leaves his wife with his friend and his friend's sister while he's away. And so Hutter gets to Transylvania and is warned that he should not go into the area where the castle is, and that area is called the Land of the Phantoms. And people refuse to take him all the way up to the castle, and they warn him, don't go at night. And while he's at an inn, before he actually gets to where the castle is, he finds a book that goes over what vampires do, and like kind of what vampirism is thus far. And he takes this book with him. And so it's kind of interesting that throughout the film, it will cut to things, cut to people reading this book and reading kind of the rules of vampires. So he meets with Count Orlok, and they have dinner, and during dinner he cuts himself, and Count Orlok tries to drink his blood. And from there, he wakes up the next morning and he finds that he has been bitten by something he presumes are mosquitoes, but of course we know that is not the case. So after this next morning, that night, he meets with Count Orlok again and gets him to kind of sign the papers to the deed. And Count Orlok sees a picture of Mr. Hutter's wife and remarks about how beautiful her neck is. And so from that point on, it's kind of a race between the characters to get back to his wife. I really enjoyed this film. I think that Count Orlok is just a very iconic figure in horror history. I mean, it's shown up in even SpongeBob. I mean, it's such an iconic idea of what vampires and what vampirism is. So interestingly enough, one thing that I feel like isn't really mentioned about this movie, but I thought was another kind of interesting side note, is this movie also has a scene where his wife is sleepwalking. And for me, I thought it was kind of cool because for the most part, we've gotten away from this idea that people sleepwalk during uneasy times or when negative things are afoot. We've gotten away from the idea that sleepwalking is somehow connected to being in tune with evil, or with being in tune with something otherworldly. And that is probably one of my favorite aspects of this film, and it's, I think, in part because it's an adaptation of a book, and then in part because of the time when it's made, because this film was, from, I believe, 1922, and so because of that, you have a lot of the folklore elements that we really don't have in a lot of modern, films. We've kind of lost our alignment with those kinds of ideas, but there's lots of, again, it's like beware the land of the phantoms, and don't go here after dark, and those kinds of just general folklore of, it's the townspeople and what their firm beliefs are. And so, I mean, I think that charm alone is really nice, and it's really kind of refreshing after, as somebody who watches a lot of modern horror films, to see where you have this, you know, everybody has these firm beliefs. It's really nice to go back to that really, you know, I don't want to say simpler time, but definitely a much more unified time where all of the village believes that this is evil, and the idea that there are these spirits and that there's, you know, this kind of evil presence. Like I said, I loved that. So some interesting notes about this film. Like I've said, this was not an official adaptation. Prana Film Studio, who was the company who actually made this film, they didn't have any rights to make an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So what they ended up having to do was they filed for bankruptcy to try to dodge some of the copyright infringement, and unfortunately that didn't work. Bram Stoker's widow actually did sue them, and she won, which caused for most of the versions of the film to be destroyed. It would later turn up overseas, but because of that, you do have the different versions. You have the, you know, more than likely it's probably due to translations. You have the different names, and as well there's different overlays. A lot of scenes with Count Orlok are shot in the day, and it's very obvious. If you watch a version with the black and white, where there isn't a color overlay, where there's not a blue hue to the film, the scenes during the day are very obvious. The original film was actually had a blue hue for the night shots. Even though it was still in black and white, there was a blue hue too when they developed the film, which helps you to recognize that those scenes are supposed to be night. Because most of the versions that you're able to find don't have that, it becomes really apparent that the scenes are during the day. And my understanding is that even at the time, there was a little bit of criticism on the fact that the film is shot outside, it's shot in these bright settings, and a lot of people felt like it really didn't have the creepy vibe that they really wanted it to have. Personally, I still think that it's beautifully shot, and the way that it's filmed is really interesting, but I understand where a lot of people felt like it kind of lost its tone because of the really bright outdoor shots. So one other thing that was changed from the original script that was written there, because they did a screenplay based off of the book, and so Henrik Galen was the person who did the screenplay. And one thing that he added was he kind of adds this idea that the vampires brought over the plague because there were rats in the coffins. And so while I felt like watching this film, as much as I feel like a lot of people have said online, like, yes, that's kind of it, I feel like that if you actually watch the film, there's a little bit of ambiguity on whether or not there is the plague that has come over and people are 100% absolutely sick, or whether or not it's people's interpretations of the vampire causing havoc on the town, and if that is in fact the plague they believe is taking over the city. If it's these people who are being killed by the Count, and that they're saying, oh, this is the plague, that's why everyone is dying. And again, that might just be maybe I missed a couple things, but I mean, either way, I feel like that's an interesting note, because again, you know, when you look at 1920s and you look at how modern medicine was at the time, that, you know, that is one of your biggest fears. And I mean, even now it is a large fear, but I feel like it's lost a little bit of the focus or the terrifying aspect, because we have such faith in modern medicine. And at the time, you know, you are coming just 100 years from the plague, and, you know, you've seen where it's just wiped out towns and it's just wiped out villages. And so I feel like, you know, we still kind of are, at least in the States, we're a bit more sheltered to, you know, yeah, it could happen, but it's hit and miss. Some people are totally afraid of it, and other people just not so much. And there it was a little bit more of a, you know, something everybody could agree with. That is something that you all feared, was what if you get sick. So, I mean, like I said, you can't say, oh yeah, I love vampire movies, even if you go all the way down to the Twilight end of things, if that is where you're at, you can't say that you like them all without looking here, because this sets up a lot of the rules and a lot of the kind of standards for vampires in film history. One thing that was a little bit changed was that Nosferatu cannot actually be out in the light, as opposed to it just weakening them. So that is one little bit of a change, but still, a lot of the rules for vampires are set up in this film. So it's really important to go back and watch. And I felt like the pacing for this film, as far as silent films go, was actually pretty good. It's definitely a little bit of an easier watch than some other silent films that I've seen, because the pacing is pretty consistent. There's kind of a lot going on, and there aren't a lot of lull points. There's not a lot of points where people are just talking. There's a lot of action kind of throughout the film, or scenes where there's a lot of action and then a little bit of talking and then a lot of action, and so it keeps you involved throughout, without getting caught too much in some of the less interesting aspects, like, no offense, but like his wife, who's not actually involved with the account through much of the film. You're not quite as interested in her, but they kind of make it a point to not cut too much back to her until closer to when Hutter and Count Orlok are both trying to get home. So I thought that was just nice pacing throughout. But like I said, overall, this is one that you have to see. If you want to say that you like vampires, you've got to see it. You have to have just known. Again, it's knowing where you come from, and honestly, Count Orlok is a really cool, really creepy looking character. So just for that alone, just to see like the few scenes that he's in, he's fairly present throughout the movie, but there are quite a few scenes that he's just creepy, and just him being there is just creepy enough. Like, he doesn't have to do anything. It's just the way that his makeup was done was just phenomenal. So definitely want to go watch. Definitely worth it. So I will see you here tomorrow. Take care.